Hello there, and welcome to this video on the Daystate Blackwolf. In today's video, we're going to be taking a fully functioning and complete rifle and breaking it down into individual components. As we walk through this disassembly procedure, I will also be giving you some service-related tips. And before we begin, on screen now will be a complete list of all the tools I'm going to use in order to carry out this disassembly procedure. It includes all of the Allen key sizes, all of the spanner sizes, and finally any Daystate specific tooling required to complete the job. The next thing I'll mention is that this particular rifle here is a sub 12 pound 177 Blackwolf in the grey carbon stock with the bottle on the front, although the information in this video will also be relevant to the other stock options, as well as the cylinder rifles and different calibers and different power levels. With that all said and done, the first thing we're going to be doing is making sure the rifle is safe to work on by first cocking the rifle, removing the single shot loader or magazine if one is fitted, then dry firing the rifle into a nice safe backstop. What this does is ensure there's not a pellet loaded into the barrel and that we're safe to proceed. I have already done that on this particular rifle, so the next thing we're going to be doing is removing the safety. That's done by removing the small bolt on either side using a T10 Torx bit. As you remove the parts of the safety, just make sure the spacer piece comes out as well as the arm and the bolt. With that removed, the next thing we can do is remove the stock bolt by using a 5mm Allen key to remove this screw here. And with that removed, the stock can be nice and simply lifted off. We are going to place our finger over the dust cap for the filler pull, just so that doesn't fall out as we remove the stock. And there that piece is. So we can stick the stock over to one side and continue work on the action. Right then, with the action removed from the stock, the next thing we need to do is fully degas the rifle. To do that, we can flick the action up on its end and then locate the Foster fitting in the base of the rifle. What we're going to be doing then is using a deep 10mm socket to crack the Foster fitting loose. After about a turn or two, air should start to leak out of the joint of the Foster fitting and the main block of the rifle, so you'd simply need to leave the rifle to fully degas until it stopped hissing. Once that happened, you could check both gauges, so this one on this side shows us our bottle pressure, and the other one on our other side shows us regulated air pressure. Once both gauges are reading 0, we can then double check that the rifle is totally out of air by first coming to the back of the rifle, putting our power wheel on minimum, then dry firing the rifle just to make sure no air comes out the end of the barrel. At this point, I will mention that it's not uncommon once you start draining the air for the regulated air pressure not to drop. Again, all you would need to do if that happens to you is come to the back of the rifle, turn the power wheel setting to minimum, then dry fire the rifle until it was completely out of air. Now, I've already done that on this particular rifle just to save us a little bit of time, so we can continue on with the disassembly. The next thing I want to mention is the serviceability of the Blackwolf. Most of the components in the rifle are built up as sub-assemblies. So if you have a problem in one area of the rifle, you don't need to disassemble the whole rifle in order to access it. For example, if we had a problem with our barrel, that can simply be removed by simply loosening the two securing grub screws. Similarly, if we had a problem with the pressurized side of the rifle or a leak, we wouldn't need to touch any of the mechanical aspects of the rifle. We could simply access most of the pressurized components without removing any additional components. For example, we have access to the bottle joint, the regulator, the Foster fitting on the bottom, as well as the two gauges just by removing the action from the stock. If we had a problem with our valve, it'd simply be a case of removing the bottle, 4 screws, and then this entire front block comes off and we have access to the valve. So very nice and simple. The only other thing I'll mention is that I'm going to be disassembling this rifle in an order that makes it easy to film, although you can feel free to do things at a different order if you so choose. The first thing we're going to be doing is disassembling and removing the barrel and shroud. To begin with, the shroud is simply screwed onto this boss on the back of the action, and that can just be unscrewed and then pulled off. I will mention that the shrouds are normally done up fairly tight from the factory, just so they don't come loose when you're shooting the rifle. And if you are struggling to remove your shroud, you can remove the thread protector on the end here, which gives you access to these two holes here. What you could do if you were struggling to remove your shroud is insert some long 3mm pins in there, then get something like a screwdriver to crack the shroud loose, or you could use something like a set of snap ring pliers, getting the hooks put into the holes, then cracking the shroud loose. For now, we're going to be putting the shroud over to one side, and then we can remove the front shroud support, so this nut at the end. To do that, we're going to be using a thin 16mm spanner, coming in the flats there and then unscrewing it. If you wanted to install the carbon fibre stiffener onto the barrel, you would simply need to remove the nut, slide the stiffener over, then retighten the nut. For now though, we're going to be disassembling this rifle so we can continue on with the barrel. To remove the barrel, it's nice and simple. All we need to do is loosen these two grub screws using a 3mm Allen key. There we have the barrel removed. The next thing I can do is remove the back boss for the shroud, and that's done by loosening the two grub screws using a 2mm Allen key. There, that piece is there. At this point I'll mention this piece does have an O-ring on it. This isn't a constant pressure seal, it just stops air from escaping back around the shroud when we fire the rifle. If we take a look in the end of the barrel, we have our breech seal, so hopefully you can see that there. The breech seal stops air from leaking out around the pellet probe every time we take a shot. If this O-ring has failed, what will happen is you'll have a puff of air emanating from the breech area every time you take a shot, and another symptom of this O-ring failing is that the rifle may be low on power. Along with the breech seal, if we take a quick look in the block, we have another two breech O-rings which seal around the outside of the barrel. These two O-rings are located within the block, and again they stop air from escaping around the barrel every time we take a shot. There are two in the block, so one is at the back here, and there's another just in front of the transfer port within the block itself. They seal around the barrel, so one seals just here, the other seals just here, so either side of the transfer port. Again, if either one of those O-rings have failed, every time you take a shot, you'll have air leaking from the breech area, and your power may also be relatively low. With the barrel removed, the next thing we're going to be doing is tackling the pressurized side of the rifle, starting off by removing the bottle or the cylinder from the front block. So the two assemblies are pretty much identical. The only difference is the bottle comes off as one piece, whereas the cylinder has this additional end cap here. But for now, all we're going to be doing is unscrewing our cylinder or bottle from the front block. I will say that the first time you do this, the bottle will be done up fairly tight from the factory, so you may find it easier to put the action in a vise with some nice soft jaw protection, then getting both hands on the bottle or cylinder and cracking it loose. Sometimes what I like to do is put some nitrile gloves on so that my hands don't slip on the bottle. But with that said, we've uncovered one O-ring, so this O-ring here seals the joint between the bottle and the bottle housing, and if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a continuous leak of air coming from the joint of the two components. Very similarly, on the cylinder assembly, we have these two O-rings, so if both of these O-rings have failed, you'll have a leak of air coming from the joint of these two components. Similarly, on this side we have these two O-rings, and they seal on the inside of the cylinder, and if both of these O-rings have failed, you'll have air leaking up through the threads and between the joint of the components. With that said, I'll put the bottle over to one side and then we can remove the bottle housing. This is done nice and simply by using a 4mm Allen key to remove the 4 screws. And there we have the bottle housing removed, so I'm just going to pull out the 4 securing screws, and I will mention that all 4 of these screws are exactly the same length, so we don't need to worry about alignment. With that done, we've exposed another O-ring, so if we take a quick look in the block, you can see this large diameter O-ring in this section of the block. This seals the joint of these 2 components here, and if this one has failed, you'll simply have a leak of air, a continuous leak of air, emanating from the joint of these 2 components. With that done, we'll stick the block over to one side along with the cylinder components and get started on disassembling the bottle housing. Right then, on to the cylinder or bottle housing. At this point I will mention that these components are identical in every way except for the threads on the end. So this one is our cylinder, this one is our bottle housing, so we can put the cylinder housing over to one side and simply concentrate on the bottle housing, as the disassembly and assembly process for these 2 components is identical. The first thing we'll do is remove the Foster fitting from the bottom using our 10mm spanner, although this was pre-loosened when we degassed the rifle, so it should just spin out by hand. Removing this component here gives us a look at the 2 seals. We have the Doughty washer seal, which seals the base of the Foster fitting with the body, and if this O-ring or Doughty washer has failed, you'll just have a continuous leak of air emanating from the 2 components. We also have the one-way valve in the Foster fitting. This has an O-ring on the base, and if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a continuous leak of air emanating from this hole here. If we wanted to remove the one-way valve from the Foster fitting, what we can do is bring over our dive cylinder along with our Foster fitting, connect that like so, put the Foster fitting against a nice solid table or something similar, then very carefully and slowly open the valve of our dive cylinder. Once we started to hear air hiss out from the bottom, we would know that the one-way valve is removed, so we can then close the valve of the bottle. But there we have those 2 components there. Up next, we're going to be removing our regulator, and I'm going to be doing that using the Daystate specific regulator removal tool, getting the pins lined up and pushed into place. Then we can just unscrew it. And there we have our regulator removed. Owners of the Alpha Wolf and Delta Wolf, as well as the BRK Ghost, will recognize the regulator. It's the same one found in those rifles. For now, we'll put that to one side and continue work on the bottle housing. The next thing we're going to have to remove is the 2 gauges. So the first step in this operation is to remove the gauge covers. These are normally glued on from the factory and can be quite difficult to remove. The easiest way I've found to do it is to grip the gauge covers nice and firmly and then twist them in place, then twist them back and forward, removing them from the gauge itself. Once you break the factory glue, it is normally quite easy to remove them. But once the gauge covers have been removed, we can just come through with a 22mm spanner and then crack the gauges loose. And there we have it. Under each of the gauges there is an O-ring in the base of the threads. And if that O-ring has failed, you'll have a continuous leak of air emanating from the joint of the gauge and the bottle housing. Right then, moving on to the regulator. Now I will say I have done an incredibly detailed service guide for this particular style of regulator, and that can be found on the Daystate YouTube channel. So in this video we're just going to be going over it briefly, although don't worry, I will fully disassemble it, and I will also show you what things to look out for when you're servicing your regulator. To begin with, this particular regulator came out of a sub 12-pound rifle, and from the factory there was an anti-tamper sticker sticked on over the face here. I have removed that just to save us a little bit of time, but you can also see that there is a roll pin installed into the adjuster screw to stop adjustment, but luckily we can come through with a set of tweezers and just unscrew the adjuster screw from the body of the regulator. And with that done, that's the adjuster screw removed from the body. The next thing we can do is remove the regulator piston. And as you see there, as I tipped the regulator up, I just put my finger over the hole to make sure the internal valve disc doesn't get lost. So this is just a standard M4 bolt. We can screw that into the base of the regulator and then lightly pull the piston out from the bottom. As you can see there, we have our white sealing disc, or sometimes called the valve disc, along with our piston and the Belleville washers. So I'll just get you a good look at those. With that done, we've got all the regulator components laid out, and the next thing I'll do is just run through what happens if any of the O-rings fail. To begin with, we have two O-rings on the regulator adjuster screw, this one at the top and this one at the bottom. This one at the top stops bottle pressure from leaking out through the threads, so if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a leak of air from the face of your regulator. The one on the bottom stops bottle pressure from entering the regulated air chamber unmetered. If this one has failed, your reg pressure will equalize with your bottle pressure. Up next we come to the regulator body, and we have three O-rings here. This one at the top stops bottle pressure from leaking up through the threads, so if this one has failed, you'll have a leak of air coming from the joint of these two components here. Sometimes this can manifest by leaking air through one of these holes here. As you can see, this one is significantly deeper than this one. What happens with this is that you can see it breaks through this hole here. So if air is able to travel through this part here, it will travel up this hole and through one of these two holes in the face of the regulator body. Up next we have the four O-rings, which all do the same thing. So we have the two bottom ones on the regulator body, as well as the two on the piston, one at the bottom here and one at the top. All four of these O-rings stop air from entering the Belleville washer chamber. The Belleville washer chamber is vented to atmosphere through this hole here. So if any one of these four O-rings have failed, you'll have air leaking out from just under the gauge through this atmospheric bleed hole, so this one here. The last seal in the regulator is a mechanical seal between the white valve disc and the adjuster screw. If this part has failed, what will happen is you'll have excessive amounts of regulator creep. Regulator creep can be defined as any increase in reg pressure after the regulator has reached its set point. For example, if we were to set our regulator to 100 bar, then leave the rifle for 30 or so minutes, come back to it and reread the reg pressure. If it had risen to 120 bar, that would be 20 bar of creep. What we would need to do then is replace our white sealing disc or flip it over. It is two-sided, so if you've only got one used side, you can always flip the disc over and use the other side. You can tell the used sides as they will have a small dimple in them. So I'm not quite sure how well the camera will pick that up. But as you can see there, that side has a dimple. This side is flat, so that would be a usable side, and we just need to flip it. Moving back over to the action, the next thing we'll do is remove the valve. So the valve is held captive by this plate here. We can remove that by simply using a pair of snap ring pliers, coming in the holes there, then cracking it loose. Once it's loose, I'm just going to be using a set of tweezers to spin it out. With the cap off, we can then remove the valve return spring, which is just that piece there, then the valve pin itself. The next thing we're going to be doing is removing the valve body. To do that, we're going to be cocking the rifle, which exposes this grub screw in the top. We can then use a 2.5mm Allen key to crack this loose. And I will mention, from the factory, this will be done up with a small amount of Loctite, so just be aware of that. There's our grub screw. What we're going to have to do then is knock the valve out from the front of the rifle. That's nice and simple to do. We can just bash the action against our hand. So there's the valve seat along with the O-ring on the other side. And then the metal part of the valve is still within the block. And there we have it. So after a couple whacks, it came out nice and easily. The last part of the valve is usually held captive within the cover plate for the valve itself. And this can be removed just by inserting an Allen key through this hole in the front of the cap. So just that hole there, which we can use to push out the backing part of the valve. At this point I will mention that the FAC and sub 12 pound valves will look slightly different. In the FAC valves they use a balance valve design, so these two parts here will be connected to one another. With that all said, we have uncovered a few more O-rings here, so I'll just run through their purpose very briefly. To start off with, we have the valve cap, which has one sealing O-ring around it, this one here. If this one has failed, air pressure from the plenum will be able to leak through these threads here, and you'll have a leak of air emanating from the joint of these two components somewhere around here. We also have the internal seal of the valve backing piece, this piece here. This seals on the inside of the cap, and if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a leak of air emanating from the inside of this hole here. Moving on from that, we have the valve seat itself. So we have the valve seat, which is the peak pass, or the beige piece of plastic, and we also have the backing O-ring. If the backing O-ring has failed, you'll have a continuous leak of air emanating from the end of the barrel, as the O-ring will allow air to bypass through the valve, up through the transfer port, and out the end of the barrel. The same can be said of the valve seat itself, so the beige part forms a mechanical seal between the valve pin and the seat itself, and if the seal between these two components has gone bad, air will be able to bypass through the valve, through the transfer port, and up and out the end of the barrel. If you have an incredibly slow leak on your rifle, this is one area to keep a close eye on, as a bad seal between the valve seat and valve pin is probably one of the most common slow leak points of any rifle. If you're inspecting your valve seat, what you want to see is a nice clean edge with no nicks, scratches or debris built up around the contact face of the valve. The last two O-rings in the system, this one on the valve pin and this one around the valve body, are not constant seal O-rings. They only see pressure when the rifle is fired. Both the valve stem seal, this small O-ring here, and this O-ring here, stop air from entering the hammer area. So if either of those two O-rings have failed, you'll have air leaking out of the front of the valve, although only when you take a shot. A more common and recognizable symptom of these O-rings failing is that your rifle may be low on power. So if you have a low power rifle, check both of these seals here and make sure they look good. With the valve disassembled, that's all of the pressurized side of the rifle complete. We can now move over to the mechanical side. To start off with, we're going to be removing the trigger. To do that, the first thing we'll do is remove the trigger guard by loosening and then removing the two screws, one in the front and one in the back, using a 3mm Allen key. With the trigger guard removed, we can now access the two bolts that hold the trigger assembly onto the block. Again, these screws can be loosened using a 3mm Allen key, and as you remove that, just make sure that you don't lose the small spring for the safety D10. So that's just that one there. There's our trigger cassette. And if we really wanted to, we could also fully disassemble the trigger cassette. To do this, we're just going to be using a nice small Allen key or something similar to push the pins out. So the first one at the top here, we're just going to be pushing that out, then pulling it out by hand. With that one removed, we can remove the first trigger sear. So this is the latching sear which arrests the hammer. Beneath that we do also have a small spring which just gets housed in that hole there. Moving on from that, the next one we can push out is this one here. Again, being nice and careful, this one does have a couple of springs beneath it, so that's the second sear there. And I will also remove the spring from the inside of the trigger components, which is just that one there. The last thing we can do is remove the trigger blade itself, and that's done by pushing out this pin here. And the trigger itself just falls out from the bottom of the cassette, being nice and careful not to lose this spring here. The last thing we can do is remove the safety. To do that, we'll remove the small spring from the top, then simply rotate the safety 1/8 of a turn, then push the safety out. We can then use a small stack of magnets just to remove the ball bearing from this hole here. And there we have it. There's the entire trigger assembly completely disassembled. The next thing we'll do is remove the cocking arm and pellet probe assembly. To start off with, we'll flip the block over and remove this cover plate here by removing this screw here using a 3mm Allen key. With that removed, we should just be able to slide the cover plate out from the side, although if yours doesn't want to come out or feels a little stuck, you can come through with a nice thin Allen key through the back of the block and push it out from this side. The next thing we'll do is remove the securing screw on the side of the pellet probe, just this one here, using a 2.5mm Allen key. As we remove that, I will mention that this will be held in by Loctite from the factory, so it may be a little tight to remove. But with that done, we can now remove the cocking arm by using a 3mm Allen key to remove this screw here. As you remove this, just be nice and careful. The newer versions of the rifle will feature a shim on both the top and the bottom of the cocking arm, although as this is an older rifle, this one doesn't have it. So this one just has the cocking arm bush. With that done, that's the cocking arm removed. We can now just slide the pellet probe out from the front of the block. And there we have the 177 pellet probe. The last thing we can do is remove the hammer spring adjuster, the hammer spring and the hammer from inside the block. To start off with, we're going to be removing this back cap here by loosening these two screws here. Now on this rifle, as it is a sub 12 pound rifle, it is fitted with an anti-tamper screw along with a standard screw. On the FAC rifles, these will both be standard screws, however this one is a sub 12 one. The standard screw can be removed just using a 3mm Allen key, and the anti-tamper bolt can be removed using the 3-pin tool. With both bolts removed, we can nice and carefully remove this cover piece here, putting that nice and safely over to one side. Then we can remove the hammer spring adjuster. On this rifle, it has a power washer installed over the hammer spring adjuster, so I'm just going to keep a close eye on that to make sure it doesn't get lost, as well as the small ball bearing in the top of the adjuster. The next thing we can do is remove the key, so this part here, from the back of the rifle. Sometimes what you can do is get your finger in the back and pull it out. Other times what I like to do is come back through with an O-ring pick, then nice and carefully push it out from the back. This part does have an O-ring around it, although this is just to stop the piece rattling in the block. It is not a pressure seal. With that removed, we can just tip the hammer spring out from the back, and that comes out along with the anti-rattle guide. The last thing we can do is remove the hammer, and to begin with we're going to need to remove the pellet probe D10. So this piece on the top can be removed using a 2mm Allen key. So there's that part there. And then what we can do is remove the cocking dog. Now I'm going to be doing this using a nice high quality 2mm Allen key to loosen the 2 grub screws in the top of the dog. We only need to loosen these 1 or 2 turns, then we can tip the action back and allow the hammer to fall out the back of the action, keeping a close eye out for the dog as well. So when the hammer and the cocking dog are assembled in the rifle, it looks something like that. All you saw me do then was crack these 2 screws loose, then tip the action back and allow the hammer to fall out the action and allow the dog to fall out the bottom. I will make you aware that these 2 grub screws are usually done up using red Loctite from the factory, so make sure you use a high quality Allen key and that you're nice and careful as you loosen them. You don't need to remove them entirely, just a turn or 2 loose should allow the piece to slide off the hammer. Right then, and that's the Blackwolf broke down into its individual components and fully disassembled. That's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. In our next video, we'll be taking all of the individual components and rebuilding them into a complete and functioning rifle. For now though, thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.